Welcome to the College Admission Lab from Khan Lab School. I am your host, Brennan Barnard. I'm the Director of College Counseling, and I am joined today by our founder, Sal Khan. And Sal is the founder as well of and CEO of Khan Academy and Schoolhouse.World and Khan World School. And he's also author of The One World Schoolhouse and more recently, Brave New Words, How AI Will Revolutionize Education and Why That's a Good Thing. Welcome, Sal. And our guest tonight is Jonathan Williams, who is the Vice President and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Pomona College. And Jonathan has worked as an admission leader at Oberlin College, the University of Pennsylvania, Dartmouth College, and most recently New York University, where he was the Associate Vice President and undergraduate admission, pre-college access, and pathways. That's quite a mouthful.
That's right. Yeah, you're going to take a drink of water now.
That's right. You went to Pomona just so you get a shorter title, right?
That's
Well, thanks for joining us, Jonathan. And maybe you could just start by giving us a little brief overview of your educational journey, kind of how you got to where you are.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and thanks for having me. This is a real honor, a real treat, and looking forward to this conversation. So I grew up in southwestern PA, just outside of Pittsburgh. Go Steelers! And I'm a first generation college going kid, but it was one of those things where there was never a question as to whether or not I would go to college because on a regular basis, my mother would tell me, "Boy, you're going to college." But the challenge was that I didn't really understand what that meant, and for a while, sort of thought that I'd show up at some building, had college across the front of it, and I'd walk in and say, "Here I am." Obviously, it doesn't quite work that way. I was pretty fortunate to be a recruited athlete, and had a few schools that I got a chance to consider, but ended up going to Dartmouth College. And you can imagine coming from southwestern PA, going to Hanover, New Hampshire was a bit of a journey, not only physically, but just mentally and emotionally being exposed to things that I'd just never really been exposed to. It was an amazing four years there, and majored in French, modified with history and government. Really had this amazing exposure to all of this academic work. Graduated and said, "Okay, that was nice. Now what?" Went to talk to an advisor who had been in the dean's office and moved to the admissions office. She said, "Look, we've got an opening. Why don't you apply? And you can utilize our career services office while you are here and pursue other avenues." But from day one, I was introduced to what the possibilities were in the admissions world and just fell in love. And so ended up doing admissions work for about 10, 12 years. Dartmouth, at University of Pennsylvania, at Oberlin College. I also served as a college counselor for a while at an independent day school in Philadelphia. And I went back to school, got a master's degree from University of Maryland, and sort of promptly stumbled out of admissions, direct admissions. Started working for the federal government, ran some nonprofits, all work focused on access and helping young people find their path to higher education. And just as I had stumbled out of admissions, I stumbled back into admissions, doing some work with NYU from a nonprofit status. Position became open, and I was hired to lead that admissions office there. So it's been a great journey. Most recently, hired to lead the team here at Pomona, and it's been fascinating having all of that experience and being able to show up here and hopefully do some good things while I'm here.
Well, and I was saying earlier, it snowed here today in New Hampshire, and so I'm sure you're not wishing you were back at Dartmouth right now. So
75 and sunny, brother. Sorry.
loving it, loving it. Well, to that point, you've had this range of different experiences, obviously, in different types of colleges and universities, smaller large colleges, Ivy League institutions, big New York University. Can you talk about kind of like Pomona and small liberal arts colleges. And what kind of student is that a good match for that type of education? And how is that different than it might be going to a Dartmouth or something like that?
Yeah, yeah. Great question. And I think, for a lot of your guests, there's underneath that question, they're sort of trying to figure out, well, what's the thing that I do to make myself competitive? Um, the reason I appreciate the question is that really this whole process starts with the individual student and taking the time to understand who they are, how do they learn, how do they think, and then you begin to discover that there are institutions out there that actually match the person that you are, as opposed to having to figure out how to configure yourself into something that you think the institutions would like. The foundation of a liberal arts education is critical thinking, and for the young person who sees connections between different academic disciplines, uh, and likes the idea of exploring different topics, whether it's something that falls into the category of science or social science or humanities, and likes to explore the possibilities around an idea. A liberal arts environment can really satisfy that. That can really feed that curiosity. And so, a lot of times, and I think more so now than when I first started in this business, there seems to be a little bit of a pressure to know exactly what it is that you want to study, and to then commit yourself to pursuing that all the time. The value and the advantage of a liberal arts institution is that when you change your mind, and you will change your mind, some people change their mind in really significant ways. Others just see things a little bit differently. The liberal arts experience teaches you how to make that pivot, and to really enjoy and explore what that pivot is all about. So that by the time you graduate with a degree from Pomona College, you feel empowered to uh, launch yourself into whatever career you might choose. But you also feel a certain confidence that if things don't work out, you can adapt. You can be flexible. I would say that those things can be true at a large research institution, but one of the distinctions that a small residential liberal arts college provides is a lot more intimacy with the faculty and the administrators who are helping to guide those students through this process, and you get to learn. You have a front row seat in that learning environment, in a way that sometimes isn't available at larger institutions.
That's really helpful. And I mean, Sal, what kind of students do you see drawn to smart liberal arts colleges? And I think oftentimes students and families they hear of the NYU's or the Dartmouths or the University of Pennsylvania's. But Sal, do you have any thoughts on kind of how folks can think about that different experience? And you're muted.
I don't claim to be an expert here. I'm actually learning alongside everyone else here. But my sense is the more that I've learned about liberal arts colleges like Pomona over the last several years, the more there's definitely some very compelling things about them that you don't get at the large universities. Even some of the more well-resourced large research universities that their headline student to teacher ratio will look quite good, but you still could end up in a freshman class with 100, 200, 300 students, where you may not get a great chance to get to know the professor. You might get to know the teaching assistants much more. That doesn't happen, as far as I know, at the smaller liberal arts colleges. That you will usually find yourself in groups of 10, 12, 15, maybe sometimes 20, 25 students. So that, but in and of itself is, I think, a pretty compelling thing. What I hear, people have definitely, if you go to some random part of the world, people are definitely going to have heard of some even large flagship state universities like a Berkeley, or a large research university like a Harvard or a Dartmouth or a Columbia, more than they might have heard of a Pomona. But people in
Mhm.
the know that they're, kind of all in the same place. And, I think that attention level, the more that I see these smaller liberal arts colleges like Pomona, I'm pretty. I was actually I gave a talk at Harvey Mudd earlier
Oh,
this school year, and I like visiting college campuses. So right after my talk, I just started wandering, and I was kind of blown away by the Claremont colleges, how they're all really right next to each other. And we have a student from Con Lab School who's at Claremont McKenna, so I walked over there, and then we have a student at Harvey Mudd, and then I walked over to Pomona. I really enjoyed y'all student center. They're like,
oh,
who's this
awesome.
guy walking around at 9 p.m.? Anyway, I hope I didn't. But yeah, it's very compelling. And actually, I have a question on, Brennan's question was more of how is Pomona maybe a little bit similar or different than, say, a Dartmouth, a UPenn, or an NYU?
Hmm. Hmm.
When you go from one admissions office to another, I mean, that's actually a
Hmm.
very interesting sample, because I can imagine the same student applying to all four of those schools. All of
Right.
those are very high caliber. You imagine a student who has all the right academic credentials, leadership, writes some, thoughtful essays, etc. When you've gone from one place to another, did you say, oh, yeah, all students are strong, but UPenn is especially looking for this, or Dartmouth or NYU, or now Pomona is definitely, it's different. It's, there's
Yeah.
definitely a kind of kid that might get admitted to Pomona, but not Dartmouth, and vice versa.
It's such an important question, Sal, because I think too often this college admissions process is lumped under this sort of monolithic umbrella, as if we are all the same. But there are a couple of things that do change, even though we all commit. Every institution that I've worked at, we commit to a holistic evaluation of the student. But the reason that I say that the process really begins with the student is that, if a student asks me, what is Pomona looking for? That's not helping them, right? Because I need athletes, I need poets, I need physicists, I need a whole bunch of things. Those are institutional priorities that are governing not just what the admissions office is looking for, but what the culture of that institution is like. And certain students will be attracted to that. Similarly, at a place like NYU, which is the largest private R1, or which is a research classification, largest private research institution in the country. You can imagine the type of student who's attracted to an urban environment, the hustle and bustle, and the frankly competition within the classroom. For that environment is going to be very different from the student who's attracted to Pomona, or even Dartmouth, which is a mid-size research institution. And so part of it is just built into the DNA of these different institutions, and where we started, where we are today, and what our institutional priorities are. Yes, we're all committed to diversity. Yes, we're all committed to an excellent learning environment, but the kind of environment that is created is very different. Um, a 7-to-1, your point of a 7-to-1 student ratio looks very different here than it does at other institutions.
So how does a student, juniors are kind of starting out their college search,
Yeah,
right? And how do they kind of lean into those institutional priorities? How do they get a sense for those?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, as students, you have to do your research. It's so important to understand that this is a process. This is not a one and done. Oh, I'm going to look up school X on their website, and that will determine whether or not I'm going there. This is a process, and it's a process of self-reflection. What do I like about an academic environment? How do what kind of citizen am I in my current situation? Where I'm in high school? What are the things that really appeal to me? What do I think about being in the middle of a city versus in the suburbs, or in a rural environment? And it's important to reflect on those things, because that's what helps the student, once they are on campus, to flourish when they are surrounding themselves with the things that they like. So it's so much less about the name of the institution, and so much more about what that student may want from that experience. I tell students to journal all the time. And through that journaling, you begin to reflect on how you react to, uh, that time you went to the basketball game and there was a buzzer beating shot, and what that meant to you. Were you paying attention to the band versus the game? What are the things that drive you as a young person? You can have all of that in your college environment. There's no reason to give any of those things up, but you need to understand what they are. And that's the research. It starts there. And then you start asking questions of these different institutions. How do you meet the kinds of things that are that I'm interested in and that I want from a college environment?
Thanks. Yeah. Sal, there's a question here in the Q&A, and you went to a STEM school, right? You went to MIT and at Institute of Technology. And the question is, what's the main difference between the liberal arts and STEM related colleges? Like, how would you kind of unpack that for people? So
My personal opinion, I think maybe when some schools like MIT first started 160, 170 years ago, they maybe were pretty different, that the traditional universities were, focused on the classics and let's call it a liberal education, while, MIT, which I believe was the first engineering college in existence, it very much focused on this field that other universities didn't even think was kind of worth focusing on. I think you now, if you were to compare, say, an MIT to, right down the street, there's Harvard, or it, they're probably quite similar in terms of the, what's expected of you, et cetera, et cetera. I think if you go to a STEM school, you're just going to have a much larger number of people who are in STEM subjects, but you definitely will also see people who are in the humanities, and, and MIT, things like linguistics and political science and economics and music are very popular. But I think it is, some people might want a place like an MIT. I think Caltech is much smaller, but where they want this focus on, like, hey, it's all about, like, what, pushing the frontiers of science or pushing the frontiers of engineering or tech, or how it intersects with society. But some people might like even broader diversity. Is like, hey, I want to meet people who aren't, double majoring in the classics. I want to meet people who that's their primary major. I want to have so I think that's the biggest one. But I would say my view, I'm curious what Jonathan is, MIT is much closer to, Harvard and Stanford and Dartmouth than all of those are to Pomona. And in some ways, Harvey Mudd, which is considered kind of a STEM school, is maybe it's someplace in between a little bit, but it has a lot of the trappings of a Pomona, maybe with that STEM focus.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. I think there has been learning over these many, many years from for all of these institutions about things that work and things that are of value in an educational environment. To extend the example that Saul was giving, one of the advantages of being at NYU is that I got a chance to see these different kinds of schools and how they would approach their education. So you have a conservatory-like program like Tisch, or nursing school like the Rory Myers Nursing School, both of which are very specific kinds of educational environments. And yet, in both of those institutions, even though the majority of your coursework will be very pre-professional, there's a liberal arts component, right? Because there's an understanding that how you apply what you're learning to other disciplines can broaden your perspective. And so, yeah, there is some coming together, I think, of these institutions, but at the same time, for folks who have a passion for a particular direction, you can find that as well. So yeah, I do think, Sal, you're absolutely right. Compared to the start of these different institutions, there has been a little bit of blending so that they look a little more similar.
Well, and again, it's back to your point about journaling, Jonathan, and students knowing what they want, right? I mean, we have a student, a graduate from Con Lab School, who is at Northwestern and is studying data science and opera, right? Double majoring. And like,
Yeah.
it's kind of how how do you understand your interests, your passions, what's important to you in that experience, and then finding a school that will honor all of that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and there's a
And
question.
what I one of the things I love about Pomona is you see that reflected in the faculty, the folks who are teaching here. Our president, for example, has a doctorate in English literature and a doctorate in neuroscience, right? And you know, talk about pulling together two seemingly disparate areas, but you know is able to draw that through line between the two, and that's just to me that's such an amazing experience that you can spend your undergraduate years putting these kinds of pieces together.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk a little bit about 3-2 programs? There's a question about whether Pomona has
Mhm.
a 3-2 program and how that works, because that kind of again bridges the liberal arts and STEM fields.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have a 3-2 program per se, but the value of coming to a place like Pomona is that we are part of this consortium. As Sal mentioned, you can literally walk from campus to campus to from Pomona to four other colleges, and we very seamlessly allow students to register for courses at the other colleges. And so anybody who's interested in getting a STEM background, they can take advantage of coursework at Harvey Mudd. You know, we obviously we have classes in the sciences as well, but depending on the kind of environment that you want, you can pursue those sorts of things. And that's one of the things that as students are doing their research, to understand what is that relationship. Particularly for a residential liberal arts institution, what's the relationship with other schools around it or across the globe? Are there exchange programs? Are there, you know, and what's the ease of being able to take advantage of that? Yes, we have the Five College Consortium here in um, uh, the eastern part of LA County. Uh, there's another consortium up in New England with Amherst and those schools, and you know, and you can find these opportunities all around the country if that's something that you're interested in. There are plenty of 3-2 accelerated engineering programs across the country. The question is, you know, exactly why are you looking for that kind of opportunity, and understanding what it means for you to pursue it.
Yeah, I mean that's the consortium, the five colleges consortium in the Claremont schools is probably the kind of guiding light of those kinds of programs. I mean, having visited there and seen how, like you said, seamless it is, and it's like going to a small liberal arts college, but having the resources of a bigger university, right? Because
That's it exactly. That's it exactly.
yeah. Um, so there's a question here from Annie about the number of schools that kids are applying to kind of skyrocketing, and any thoughts, opinion on how many schools a student should limit their, or how many schools a parent should limit their child to applying to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give my initial thoughts, but I'm more curious what y'all think. I have
Happy
a
to weigh
son
in.
who's going to be a junior next year. So, look,
Okay.
honestly, I can see both sides of this argument. I definitely hear from Brennan and from the professionals of the world that like, look, you got to focus on, let's call it 10, maybe max 15, because you got to know the universities, et cetera, et cetera. But I definitely know families, some of whom had success where, their kids did apply to 25, 30 schools. And, when you talk to them, their argument is, look, what's Pomona's acceptance rate? 4%? So
Yeah.
if someone were to apply to all of the schools that you've worked at, Jonathan, it's they're averaging what, like a 5% acceptance rate
Yeah.
across all of them, something like that. So, and it's not like a pure random 5%. I think a student who's well qualified has a higher probability, but still not a huge probability. It's not a likelihood. So,
Mhm.
my gut sense of what I try to advise kids is, yeah, get to know, like for a student who I think who has a very strong application and who is very thoughtful and introspective about their essays, and their essays are really um, showing something about them that would truly stand out. And I think that's where I've seen most kids kind of they get into this they feel that the college admissions is such high stakes that they take a very conservative stance on their essays, and then it doesn't really show anything about. I've seen that sometimes, and I think
Yeah.
that's where I see. But if a student has a strong applicant, great essays, recommendations, extracurriculars, etc., I think probably that 10 to 15 does make sense. But I sympathize with the folks who feel like they need to do more just to play the probabilities. I'm curious what y'all think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in, and then Jonathan, you can kind of follow up. Like you said, I mean, I think once you start getting, I mean, there are always reasons to apply to more or less, and some students, especially if financial aid or affordability is a big part of their decision, they need to have options, right? And I think once you start getting much over 15 schools, um, like you said, you kind of lose the ability to really put energy and thoughtfulness into those applications and the supplements and all that kind of thing. I also think you run the risk of hearing a lot of bad news. And so, I mean, it depends on what that list is made up of, right? If you have like three schools that you're pretty sure of, and then you have, 25 schools that are the most selective in the country, I think you're setting yourself up to hear a lot of bad news, and that can be hard to kind of process. Um, and um, and there's I think for students who you're both in California and Khan Lab schools in California, and I think sometimes when with the UC system, maybe your list is a little larger because it's easy to just apply to multiple campuses at once. But I think it really depends on kind of what you're trying to achieve, and if you have on your list um, Pomona and NYU, those are very different schools. And are you doing your homework ahead of time to kind of narrow down the list to what you really want, or are you just kind of putting out applications to schools you've heard of? Jonathan,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, that last part for sure. And like, what do you want to spend your time doing? I mean, that's a lot of work to put together 30 applications, where maybe, at best 10 of them are places where you actually enjoy going to school. I think, and I understand it. I think that there's a stress out there that suggests that there's some magic formula, and either you're going to play the percentages and you'll have this really long list, and yeah, you'll probably get to a few schools for this long list. um, but the part of the equation that tends to get lost when adding this really long list is, just what's the probability of enjoying yourself at those institutions? What's the probability of those institutions meeting your individual needs? I think it's important to have a balance, and really using that time to research what schools you really like, um, uh, and then committing to those, and committing to putting together the best application you possibly can for that well-researched list, as opposed to just adding schools because you've heard of them.
Thanks. So I'd love to just kind of get both your thoughts on AI. We had a number of questions come in during the registration about the use of artificial intelligence in college admission, and both from the kind of student search and application end of things and the college side of things. And Sal, maybe we'll start with you and just kind of your hopes for how students, families might use it as they start to lean into the college process, and then Jonathan, maybe from the college perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and I've written a lot about it in my book. Is there's always been a lot of gray area on like how much help is okay versus too much. Obviously, there's like the varsity blue scandal that's clearly too much, and you're fabricating things, and or if someone's like just writing your essays for you. But I think most of us think it's great to brainstorm topics with someone as long as it's your story, and it's great to get feedback from folks. And so I think those are legitimate use cases of an AI as well. And we have some of those tools on Khan Academy. I'm sure if you're good at prompting, you can get some useful help on that front from an AI. But it really should be your own story. And I think most of the essays at most places are crafted to make it hard to make them generic. In fact, you're generic, you're probably not going to get in. It really needs to be your story and not made up. I do worry, and this is where I'm curious what y'all think and what Jonathan thinks. Yeah, the college essay came out in a day and age before we had many things. I think it does have some really interesting properties around it. I think when it's done well, you can read into kind of a person's soul a little bit. But I do worry that, I've seen two equivalent kids that I think are both great and one either just kind of got how to write an essay or probably just got a little extra help of what makes a great essay. So it was just more fun to read. It was a little bit humorous. It showed a little bit of, while the other student, who I think is equally good, came off a little bit more conservative. Maybe they just got bad advice from someone to not take risks a little bit on the essay. And they get different outcomes. Usually the first one that took a little bit of risk, not too much risk, usually does better. So I worry to some degree about, how that sometimes plays out. I also wonder, we have to think about bias, et cetera, et cetera. Are there not new ways? I know like University of Chicago does have some videos as part of their admissions process. I do, obviously that you have things like interviews as part of admissions processes, but most people don't super weight them because they're done by alumni and they're super inconsistent and sometimes, obviously always maybe a little bit of bias, but maybe there's ways to leverage AI real time with the video. I don't know. There could be some interesting things that might take us beyond the essay. And the same thing about recommendations. I've seen amazing kids. This is when I was in high school. One of my classmates, he really amazing young, but I remember it somehow came out. I think this was back when you could actually see your recommendation, but like the teacher he asked wrote like, oh, so and so turns his assignments in on time. He's a good student, has no and that's not going to get you in anywhere, even though he's a really amazing kid. But that professor just didn't know what it would take. So I do worry about that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm old enough to remember the controversy around spell check when spell check came out, and people were concerned that applicants were cheating on their essay because they were using spell check. So, point being that when you understand something like AI as a tool to help you put together a better essay, if that's the case, and that's how it's used, then by all means use that tool. I mean, how much different is that than in employing your village to read your essay and give feedback? Talking to your English teacher, your family members. But one of the things that is true about students who apply using the Common Application, which now has about 1,000 different members, is that at the end of the application, right before you submit it, you have to check a box that attests to the fact that everything that is submitted is true and your own work. So that's something to consider, is that you are committing to having submitted something that is yours. And not something that is necessarily computer generated, but using it as a tool. I get that, and the other piece that Saul was alluding to, the essay, for example, is the only opportunity in the application process for a student to use their voice, to communicate in their voice, to tell the admissions team, this is what I want you to know, and on our side of things. A place like Pomona is not using AI to make decisions, period, full stop. You may find many colleges and universities who will use chatbots to respond to questions that come in. And you may find that AI is being used to help sort and organize applications before admissions officers sit down to read them. But this is still very much a human process. And as a human process, as we're evaluating applications and we're looking at teacher recommendations and how that relates to students' performance in the classroom through their their transcript, and just trying to get a full picture of who that student is. A lot of us, us old heads who've been in it for a while, the most exciting part is to get a chance to sit down and read an essay. Um, we're not expecting a student to be, the next Pulitzer Prize winner, but we are expecting them to communicate what's important to them. And that's the key. A lot of people will say, well, how do I stand out? You stand out by being yourself. If you think about this process as each application is like a fingerprint, everybody's going to be different. They're going to answer the questions differently. Even if the themes that they use are similar, each individual person will answer the questions differently. If those answers are inconsistent with the other information in the applicant pool, then that could help somebody stand out in the wrong way. But when we see consistency from transcripts and academic interests and um, uh, teacher recommendations and council recommendations, consistency through the information that we get there through to the essay, then that's actually the part that helps us make the decisions that we need to make.
The kind of triangulation of all the information coming in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Never one piece of data makes the decision. It's all of that put together.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And there's a question, I think you pretty much just answered it about, is it okay to get help from chatbots and tools like Grammarly when crafting essays? And I don't think there's an admission office that would say don't use Grammarly. I mean, so many of us use it in our daily lives and things like that. So as we wrap up here, I'd love for you, we have a lot of parents tuning in tonight, and I'd love for you both to just kind of leave us with kind of your greatest hope for parents in this process as parents think about how to approach this. And I know, Sal, you're coming up on the college process as a parent yourself, but what are your, and maybe we'll start with you, Jonathan, and then come to Sal about kind of your greatest hope for folks.
Yeah. So I'm fortunate to have two adult children who've gone through this process. They are not living with us. They are fully employed and engaged in life. 31-year-old and 28-year-old. But I often point to this time in our lives together as a really important foundation for how we engage with one another now. Because my hope, so this is tied to my hope for parents, is that you recognize that you have a young adult or soon to be young adult going through something that they've never gone through before, and having to answer some really, really big questions for themselves, but not necessarily really having the tools to do it. And so my encouragement and my hope for parents is that they become facilitators in this process, that they leave the dictator part of parenting behind, become the facilitator, and help use their experience to help their student understand the answer to the questions that are in front of them. And to this day, my relationship with my children, I think is pretty solid, because we entered this as a bit of a partnership. And so that's my hope for all the parents, is that they get to enjoy working with their kids the way I enjoyed working with mine.
That's so true. I had the same experience. Sal, wrap us up here.
Yeah, well, I'm just following up on that. At the same time that kids are starting to get on that on-ramp for college and college admissions, this is also the time that we as parents start to say, wow, we're only going to have 2 years, a year and a half with them in the house, etc. And wouldn't it be a shame to waste that year and a half with conflict and stress and projecting insecurities? And that's not how you want to, you don't have that memory, you don't want them to have it. So I try to remember that first and foremost. Like, these are precious moments, irrespective of college admissions, et cetera, to just enjoy these final years of childhood, so to speak, or being together as a family. So that's kind of, I think, number one. I think number two, it doesn't, I think as parents, if we feel like we have some knowledge, institutional knowledge, et cetera, it's valuable to make ourselves available. I think sometimes students can benefit from gently given advice. Although, sometimes it comes a lot better from someone else other than your parents, that, even if it's the exact same advice. So you have to be very careful, because even as I try to remember, even when I'm trying to give gentle, hey, you might want to think about this, it can come with a lot of extra baggage. So I try to keep that in mind. And I also try to remind myself, like, a lot of what I think I benefited from when I went through the process myself is I didn't have anyone projecting anything onto me. And I took a very, it was a different time, et cetera, 30 years ago. But, I applied to 4 schools. I mean, maybe that's not, you can't do that anymore. But it was a very, simple, like, okay, the local, I'm going to apply to Tulane. It's a great school. It's down the street from where I live. A really smart kid from my school went to Rice last year. It seems like a great school. I want to be an engineer. I want to go, I'll apply to Rice. My sister was at Brown, and I had read a lot about MIT, and I applied to MIT. But what was important about my process is I was fine going to any of those schools. And I think I could have been happy going to any of those schools. And that liberated me when I wrote my essays to just kind of write who I was. And, someone asked, I gave this, like, being conservative versus taking a little bit of risk on your essays. All I'm saying is be yourself. And I'll give an example on the Khan Academy later, and I'll try to model something in the essays. There's a lot of people, like, when I started making videos for Khan Academy, if someone said, hey, Sal, this is one day going to be viewed by 1 billion people, I probably would have, like, freaked out and started writing scripts. And Khan Academy videos probably would have felt like the next step of photosynthesis. Like everything else you see from these publishers, very boring, dry, low risk, no personality in it, but it would have been perfect. It would have had no errors, perfect graphics, etc. I had the luxury when I started of, hey, I'm making these videos for my cousins. I'm going to be myself. I'm cracking my dad jokes or cousin jokes, whatever. I'm making a few mistakes, but I'm backing up. I'm like, wait, no, that's not the way to do it. My eccentricity shows up. And it turns out that that's what more people connected with. And so put yourself in the minds of Jonathan. They might not say this, but you got to read thousands of essays. And I mean, you're saying you enjoy it, but I'm sure a lot of them, you're kind of like, oh, another one of these, another one of those. Like, oh, let's imagine a young Sal who knew he wanted to do Khan Academy. And I didn't. I thought I wanted to be a physicist, and I go to CS, and I wanted to be a doctor. So I didn't know. But let's say at age 17, I knew that I wanted to do Khan Academy. A conservative essay would have been like, our children are the future. As a volunteer tutor for Mu Alpha Theta, which I am the president of, I learned that it's important for students to fill in their gaps. All of that's true, but it would have felt kind of dry and very, versus, like, if I started, like, I just realized that there's a ton of kids that look just like me in Bangladesh who I'm probably related to, who have zero opportunity. Or, start with something like a hook, like, or, when I traveled there and I saw kids living next to the runway of the airport who looked just like me, and I said, well, what really is the difference between me and them? And, and it's education. Or, the moment that I realized that I wasn't necessarily smarter than my friends, but I had just gotten the benefit of filling in some of my gaps. And then that's why I want to dedicate my life to education, so that, I think if you just make it a little bit more, you just think about the reader. Is it going to put a smile on their face? Is it going to make them emote somehow? Is it going to make them feel, root for you as an individual, as a human being? I think you have a much better shot. Now, there's extremes. I heard about one kid who wrote an essay about feeling bad about killing a spider, and he actually included the spider, the dead spider, in a Ziploc. That's an extreme. That's an extreme. I don't think that was well, but
Way
you
to
know,
stand.
but it could be a story about how you became a vegetarian because you realized that, you feel bad killing. I don't know. I don't want to project onto anyone. But anyway, make it interesting, make it exciting, and make it your own.
That's great. And allow your children to do that as well.
Yeah, I wrote mine about some dream I had, and I woke up and it was a true story, and I just wrote it, and it was just, and it was different. I'm probably.
But the key, the critical piece there was that it was you. It was coming
Yeah.
from you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate your time and your energy and enthusiasm for this, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. Next in April, we're going to have Mickey Kidder on from Notre Dame, and so we will send out information on that. And Jonathan, thanks for all the work you do. Good luck landing the next class these next couple weeks. And
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
we'll see you all next time. Thanks so much.